Remember when poverty and unemployment were at their peak in the Great Depression? Many families survived on government relief programs, and some were dying from hunger. But wacky and war cake was the hope Grandma baked to keep families fed. Somehow, we forgot the flavors that kept our seniors alive. Let's rediscover 30 Depression-era cakes made from scraps. You'll wish they never vanished. It was basic, but tomato soup cake was a lovable dessert on every thrifty table. Grandma opened a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup and mixed it with flour, sugar, baking soda, and spices, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. She added a little shortening or lard, no eggs, no milk, just the soup and spices mixed by feel. The tomato soup gave it moisture and a hint of sweetness, and the spices covered up any tomato taste. She poured the batter into a greased pan and baked it until it was dark and fragrant. Families ate it plain or with cream cheese frosting. Some grandmas added raisins or chopped nuts. The soup made it so moist it stayed fresh for days. By the 1980s, boxed spice cakes replaced the By Heart version, and tomato soup cake vanished from home kitchens. It was plain, but crazy cake was a lovable dessert on every farmhouse table. Grandma made it just like wacky cake, but without the cocoa, just flour, sugar, baking soda, and salt mixed right in the pan. She poked 3 holes in the dry ingredients, poured oil in one, vinegar in another, and vanilla in the third. Then she added water, stirred it with a fork until smooth, and baked it without a single egg or drop of milk. The vinegar made it rise, and the vanilla gave it a sweet, simple flavor. Families ate it warm with butter or a drizzle of homemade icing. Some grandmas added a handful of raisins or a sprinkle of cinnamon. By the 1980s, store-bought vanilla cakes replaced the By Heart version, and crazy cake disappeared from home kitchens. It was simple, but wacky cake was a lovable dessert on every Depression-era table. Grandma didn't need eggs, milk, or butter. She mixed it right in the baking pan. She stirred together flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, and salt in a greased pan. Then she poked 3 holes in the dry ingredients, 1 for oil, 1 for vinegar, 1 for vanilla. She poured water over everything, stirred it with a fork until smooth, and slid it into the oven. No bowls, no mixer, no measuring cups, just by feel. The vinegar reacted with the baking soda and made the cake rise like magic. Families ate it plain or with a dusting of powdered sugar. By the 1980s, boxed cake mixes replaced the By Heart version, and wacky cake vanished from home kitchens. Before we move on, many of you asked in the comments where to find these recipes. We even received tons of email, too, so we published these recipes on our website. The link is in the description. Let's continue. It was humble, but war cake was a lovable dessert on every wartime table. Grandma started by boiling raisins in water with sugar, butter if she had it, and spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. The raisins plumped up and made a thick, sweet syrup. She let it cool, then stirred in flour and baking soda. No eggs, no milk, just the syrup and flour mixed by feel. She poured the batter into a greased pan and baked it until it was dark, dense, and fragrant. The raisins kept it moist for days. Families ate it sliced thin with coffee or tea. Some grandmas added chopped nuts or a handful of dried apples. By the 1980s, packaged spice cakes replaced the By Heart version, and war cake vanished from home kitchens. It was modest, but poor man's cake was a lovable dessert on every Depression table. Grandma boiled raisins, dried apples, and sugar in water until they turned into a thick, sweet syrup. She added a pinch of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg while it simmered. Once it cooled, she stirred in flour, baking soda, and a little lard or shortening. No eggs, no milk, Just pantry staples mixed by feel. She poured the batter into a greased pan and baked it until it was dark and dense. The dried fruit kept it moist for weeks. Families ate it sliced thin, and it tasted better with age. Some grandmas added chopped walnuts or a drizzle of molasses. Then, by the 1980s, store-bought fruitcakes replaced the by-heart version, and poor man's cake disappeared from home kitchens. These 5 cakes, wacky cake, tomato soup cake, crazy cake, war cake, poor man's cake, and were made without eggs, milk, or butter. Grandma mixed them by feel, using pantry staples and whatever she had. They filled tables for pennies, and every single one has vanished from modern kitchens. It was straightforward, but vinegar cake was a lovable dessert on every budget table. Grandma mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, and salt right in the pan. She poked a hole in the dry ingredients and poured in vegetable oil, then another hole for white vinegar, and a third for vanilla. She added water, stirred it with a fork until smooth, and baked it. No eggs, no milk, no butter. The vinegar reacted with the baking soda and made the cake rise light and fluffy. Families ate it plain or with a simple glaze. Some grandmas added cocoa powder for chocolate vinegar cake. Others topped it with whipped cream or fresh berries. The vinegar taste disappeared completely when baked. By the 1980s, boxed cake mixes replaced the by-heart version, and vinegar cake disappeared from home kitchens. It was unpretentious, but mayonnaise cake was a lovable dessert on every wartime table. Grandma mixed flour, sugar, cocoa powder, and baking soda in a bowl, then stirred in mayonnaise instead of eggs and butter. The mayo had oil and egg already in it, so it made the cake rich and moist without using precious ingredients. She added water and vanilla, mixed it by feel, and poured it into a greased pan. No eggs, no butter. Just mayo and pantry staples. Families ate it with a dusting of powdered sugar or chocolate frosting. Some grandmas made vanilla mayonnaise cake by leaving out the cocoa. The cake stayed moist for days because of the oil in the mayo. By the 1980s, boxed chocolate cakes replaced the by-heart version, and mayonnaise cake vanished from home kitchens. It was rustic, but pineapple upside-down cake was a lovable dessert on every 1930s table. Grandma melted butter in a cast-iron skillet, sprinkled brown sugar on the bottom, and arranged canned pineapple rings in a pattern. She put a maraschino cherry in the center of each ring. Then she made a simple yellow cake batter. Flour, sugar, an egg if she had one, shortening and milk, mixed by feel. She poured the batter over the pineapple and baked it in the oven. When it was done, she flipped the skillet upside down onto a plate, and the caramelized pineapple and sugar became the topping. Families ate it warm with the sticky, sweet topping soaking into every bite. By the 1980s, boxed yellow cakes replaced the by-heart version, and homemade pineapple upside-down cake faded from home kitchens. It was honest, but applesauce cake was a lovable dessert on every frugal table. Grandma mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg in a bowl. She stirred in a cup of homemade applesauce instead of butter and eggs. The applesauce kept it moist and added natural sweetness. She added a little shortening or lard, mixed it by feel, and poured it into a greased pan. No eggs, no butter, just applesauce and spices. Families ate it plain or with a simple glaze. Some grandmas added raisins or chopped walnuts for texture. The cake stayed moist for days because of the applesauce. It smelled like fall, cinnamon, cloves, and apples, and filled the kitchen with warmth. By the 1980s, boxed spice cakes replaced the by-heart version, and applesauce cake disappeared from home kitchens. It was ordinary, but gingerbread was a lovable dessert on every winter table. Grandma mixed flour, baking soda, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and salt in a bowl. She heated molasses or sorghum syrup with a little shortening until it melted, then stirred it into the dry ingredients. No eggs, no butter, no milk, just molasses and spices mixed by feel. She added boiling water to thin the batter, poured it into a greased pan, and baked it until it was dark and fragrant. Families ate it warm with butter or whipped cream. Some grandmas added a handful of raisins or chopped candied ginger. The molasses made it dense and moist, and it tasted better the next day. By the 1980s, boxed gingerbread mixes replaced the by heart version, and homemade gingerbread vanished from home kitchens. These 5 cakes, vinegar cake, mayonnaise cake, pineapple upside-down cake, applesauce cake, and gingerbread, were made with pantry staples and whatever Grandma had on hand. She mixed them by feel, using no fancy ingredients. They filled tables for pennies, and all have vanished from modern kitchens. It was thrifty, but sour milk cake was a lovable dessert on every depression table. Grandma never threw away milk that had gone sour. She saved it for baking. She mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. The sour milk reacted with the baking soda and made the cake rise light and fluffy, just like buttermilk. She added a little melted shortening or lard, a splash of vanilla, and stirred it all together by feel. No eggs, no fresh milk, just what would have been thrown away. She poured the batter into a greased pan and baked it until it was golden and fragrant. The cake was tender and moist, with a slight tang from the sour milk that made it taste rich. Families ate it plain or with a dusting of powdered sugar. Some grandmas added a handful of raisins or a sprinkle of cinnamon. Others spread it with homemade jam or a simple butter glaze. The sour milk trick meant nothing went to waste, and every drop of milk, even spoiled, had a purpose. The cake stayed fresh for days, and the texture was so soft it melted in your mouth. The acidity in the sour milk tenderized the gluten in the flour, creating a delicate crumb. By the 1980s, store-bought buttermilk became cheap and available, and families stopped saving sour milk. Boxed cake mixes replaced the by heart version, and sour milk cake disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that sour milk was valuable in baking. It was humble, but molasses cake was a lovable dessert on every farmhouse table. Grandma used molasses or sorghum syrup instead of expensive white sugar. She heated the molasses with a little shortening or lard until it melted, then stirred it into a bowl of flour, baking soda, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves. She added boiling water to thin the batter. No eggs, no milk, no butter, just molasses and spices mixed by feel. The batter was dark and thin, almost like soup, but it baked into a dense, moist cake. Families ate it warm with butter or whipped cream. Some grandmas added a handful of raisins or chopped walnuts for texture. Others topped it with a simple glaze made from powdered sugar and water. The molasses made the cake dark and rich, with a deep, sweet flavor that tasted like fall. It was sturdy enough to pack in lunch pails and stayed moist for days. The spices, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, filled the kitchen with warmth when it baked. Grandma cut it into squares and wrapped it in waxed paper for the children to take to school. The molasses added iron and minerals, making it more nutritious than white sugar cakes. By the 1980s, white sugar became cheap, and molasses fell out of favor. Boxed spice cakes and gingerbread mixes replaced the by heart version, and molasses cake vanished from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that molasses could stretch sugar or that one jar could sweeten a dozen cakes. It was resourceful, but potato cake was a lovable dessert on every thrifty table. Grandma boiled potatoes and mashed them smooth, then let them cool. She mixed the mashed potatoes with flour, sugar, baking soda, and spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves. The potatoes replaced butter and eggs, making the cake moist and dense without using expensive ingredients. She added a little melted shortening, a splash of vanilla, and stirred it all together by feel. The batter was thick and sticky, and she poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was golden and fragrant. Families ate it plain or with a simple glaze. Some grandmas added raisins, chopped walnuts, or grated carrots for extra flavor and texture. The cake was dense and heavy, with a texture almost like pound cake, and it stayed moist for days because of the potatoes. The flavor was subtly sweet, with warm spices that made it taste like fall. Grandma often made it when she had leftover mashed potatoes from dinner. Nothing went to waste. She sliced it thick and served it with coffee or tea. The potatoes added moisture and tenderness without any potato flavor coming through. The starch in the potatoes created a fine, tight crumb. By the 1980s, boxed cake mixes became cheap and convenient, and families stopped using mashed potatoes in desserts. The idea of potato cake seemed strange and old-fashioned, and the by-heart version disappeared from home kitchens. Younger cooks never learned that potatoes could stretch flour and make a cake moist. It was practical, but oatmeal cake was a lovable dessert on every depression table. Grandma poured boiling water over rolled oats and let them sit until they softened and cooled. She mixed the soaked oats with flour, brown sugar, white sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, and a little melted shortening or lard. She added an egg if she had one, but often she skipped it. Just oats, flour, and sugar mixed by feel. She poured the batter into a greased pan and baked it until it was golden and set. Then came the best part, the broiled coconut topping. Grandma mixed shredded coconut, brown sugar, melted butter, and a splash of cream, spread it on top of the warm cake, and put it under the broiler until it bubbled and turned golden. Families ate it warm, and the topping was sweet, crunchy, and caramelized. Some grandmas added chopped pecans or walnuts to the topping. The oats made the cake dense and chewy, with a texture almost like a cookie. It stayed moist for days, and the flavor got better as it sat. Grandma often made it for church potlucks or family gatherings. The oats added fiber and heartiness, making it more filling than regular cake. The broiled topping was like candy on top of cake. By the 1980s, boxed cake mixes and store-bought frosting replaced the by-heart version. The broiled coconut topping seemed too much work, and oatmeal cake disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that oats could make a cake hearty and filling. It was sensible, but carrot cake was a lovable dessert on every wartime table. Grandma peeled and grated carrots on a box grater until she had 2 cups of fine shreds. She mixed the carrots with flour, sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a little vegetable oil. No eggs, no butter, just carrots and spices mixed by feel. The carrots added natural sweetness and moisture, so the cake stayed soft for days. She poured the batter into a greased pan and baked it until it was golden and fragrant. Families ate it plain or with a simple glaze. Some grandmas added raisins, chopped walnuts, or crushed pineapple for extra flavor and texture. The cake was dense and moist, with a subtle sweetness from the carrots and warm spices that made it taste cozy. The orange flecks of carrot gave it color and made it look festive. Grandma often made it when carrots were plentiful in the garden or cheap at the market. She sliced it thick and served it with coffee or tea. The carrots made it healthy enough to justify eating cake for breakfast. The natural sugars in the carrots caramelized during baking, adding depth of flavor. The cake was packed with vegetables, but tasted like dessert. By the 1980s, cream cheese frosting became the standard topping, and carrot cake became a fancy bakery item. The simple by-heart version with no frosting disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that grated carrots could replace butter and eggs, or that a vegetable could make a cake moist and sweet. These 5 cakes, sour milk cake, molasses cake, potato cake, oatmeal cake, and carrot cake, were made from leftovers and pantry scraps. Grandma mixed them by feel, wasting nothing. They turned spoiled milk, mashed potatoes, and grated carrots into desserts that filled tables. All have vanished from modern kitchens. It was clever, but banana cake was a lovable dessert on every thrifty table. Grandma never threw away overripe bananas. She mashed them and turned them into cake. She mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. The mashed bananas replaced butter and eggs, making the cake moist and sweet without using expensive ingredients. She added a little melted shortening or vegetable oil, a splash of vanilla, and stirred it all together by feel. No eggs, no butter, just bananas and pantry staples. She poured the batter into a greased pan and baked it until it was golden and fragrant. The cake was soft and tender, with a sweet banana flavor that made it taste almost like banana bread. Families ate it plain or with a dusting of powdered sugar. Some grandmas added chopped walnuts or a handful of chocolate chips. Others spread it with cream cheese frosting or a simple butter glaze. The overripe bananas, too brown to eat, became the star of the cake. The darker the bananas, the sweeter the cake. Grandma often made it when bananas were on sale or starting to spoil. She sliced it thick and served it with coffee or tea. The bananas kept the cake moist for days and added natural sweetness. By the 1980s, banana bread became more popular than banana cake, and the simple by-heart cake version disappeared from home kitchens. Younger cooks never learned that brown bananas could replace eggs and butter. It was no fuss, but coffee cake was a lovable dessert on every breakfast table. Grandma brewed a pot of strong coffee and used it as the liquid in the cake instead of milk. She mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, and a little melted shortening or lard in a bowl. She added the brewed coffee. No eggs, no milk, just coffee and pantry staples mixed by feel. The coffee gave the cake a deep, rich flavor and made it dark and moist. She poured the batter into a greased pan and baked it until it was fragrant and set. Then she made a simple crumb topping. Flour, brown sugar, cinnamon, and a little melted butter mixed until it was crumbly. She sprinkled it on top before baking, and it turned golden and crunchy in the oven. Families ate it warm for breakfast or as an afternoon snack with more coffee. Some grandmas added raisins or chopped walnuts to the batter. Others drizzled a simple glaze on top after it cooled. The coffee flavor was subtle but made the cake taste sophisticated and grown up. It was sturdy enough to pack in lunch pails and stayed moist for days. The coffee acted as both liquid and flavoring, using leftovers from breakfast. By the 1980s, store-bought coffee cakes with thick streusel toppings became popular. The simple by-heart version with brewed coffee disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that coffee could replace milk, or that one pot of coffee could flavor a whole cake. It was economical, but prune cake was a lovable dessert on every frugal table. Grandma boiled dried prunes in water until they were soft and plump, then chopped them into small pieces. She mixed the chopped prunes with flour, sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. The prunes added natural sweetness and moisture, so she didn't need butter or eggs. She added a little melted shortening or lard, the water from boiling the prunes, and stirred it all together by feel. The batter was thick and chunky with prune pieces. She poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was dark and fragrant. The cake was dense and moist, with a deep, sweet flavor from the prunes and warm spices. Families ate it plain or with a simple glaze. Some grandmas added chopped walnuts or a handful of raisins for extra texture. The prunes made the cake so moist it stayed fresh for a week. It was dark and rich, almost like fruit cake, and tasted better as it aged. Grandma often made it in the fall when dried prunes were cheap at the market. She sliced it thin and served it with coffee or tea. The prunes kept the cake tender and prevented it from drying out, even after days on the counter. By the 1980s, prunes became associated with old age and digestive health, and prune cake fell out of favor. The simple, by heart version disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that dried prunes could replace butter and eggs, or that one bag of prunes could make a dozen cakes. It was stripped down, but water cake was a lovable dessert on every bare cupboard table. Grandma made it when she had almost nothing, no eggs, no milk, no butter, just flour, sugar, water, and a little vegetable oil. She mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. She added water and oil, stirred it together by feel, and poured it into a greased pan. The cake was plain and simple, with no fancy flavors or rich ingredients. She baked it until it was golden and set. Families ate it plain or with a dusting of powdered sugar. Some grandmas added a splash of vanilla or a sprinkle of cinnamon for flavor. Others topped it with homemade jam or a simple glaze. The cake was light and airy, almost like a sponge cake, and it tasted plain but satisfying. It wasn't rich or indulgent, just a simple, sweet cake that filled bellies when there was nothing else. Grandma often made it when money was tight or the pantry was empty. She sliced it thick and served it with coffee or tea. The cake was a reminder that you didn't need expensive ingredients to make something sweet and comforting. It proved that even water could create a tender crumb when mixed with the right proportions of flour and leavening. By the 1980s, boxed cake mixes became so cheap that water cake seemed pointless. The simple, by heart version disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that water could make a cake rise and taste good. It was simple, but eggless chocolate cake was a lovable dessert on every wartime table. Grandma mixed flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. She added vegetable oil, white vinegar, and vanilla. No eggs, no milk, no butter, just pantry staples mixed by feel. The vinegar reacted with the baking soda and made the cake rise light and fluffy. She added water to thin the batter, stirred it until smooth, and poured it into a greased pan. She baked it until it was set and fragrant. The cake was moist and chocolatey, with a tender crumb that melted in your mouth. Families ate it plain or with a simple chocolate frosting made from cocoa powder, powdered sugar, and a little water. Some grandmas dusted it with powdered sugar. Others served it with whipped cream or a scoop of homemade ice cream. The vinegar taste disappeared completely when baked, and no one could tell there were no eggs. The cake stayed moist for days because of the oil. Grandma often made it for birthdays or special occasions when she couldn't afford fancy ingredients. The chemistry of vinegar and baking soda created air pockets that made the cake light and tender without needing eggs for structure. By the 1980s, boxed chocolate cake mixes with eggs became the standard. The simple, eggless version disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that vinegar could replace eggs, or that a chocolate cake could be made without a single egg or drop of milk. These 5 cakes, banana cake, coffee cake, prune cake, water cake, and eggless chocolate cake, were made from overripe fruit, leftover coffee, and plain water. Grandma mixed them by feel, using whatever she had. They filled tables when money was tight. All have vanished from modern kitchens. It was straightforward, but peanut butter cake was a lovable dessert on every depression table. Grandma used peanut butter as the fat in the cake instead of expensive butter or shortening. She mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. She added a heaping cup of peanut butter, smooth or chunky, whatever she had, and stirred it in until it was crumbly and coated the flour. She added water or sour milk, a splash of vanilla, and then mixed it all together by feel. No eggs, no butter, just peanut butter and pantry staples. The batter was thick and sticky, almost like cookie dough, and she spread it into a greased pan with the back of a spoon. She baked it until it was golden and set, and the kitchen filled with the warm, nutty smell of roasted peanuts. The cake was dense and chewy, with a rich peanut butter flavor that made it taste almost like a giant peanut butter cookie. Families ate it plain or with a simple glaze made from powdered sugar and water. Some grandmas spread it with homemade grape jelly for a peanut butter and jelly cake. Others topped it with a thin layer of chocolate frosting made from cocoa powder and butter. The peanut butter made the cake so rich and filling that one small slice was enough to satisfy. It was sturdy enough to pack in lunch pails, and it stayed moist for days because of the oil in the peanut butter. Grandma often made it when peanut butter was on sale or when she had a jar that was almost empty. She scraped every bit out of the jar and mixed it into the batter. The cake was a favorite with children, who loved the familiar flavor of peanut butter in dessert form. It was also a favorite with farmers and laborers who needed dense, calorie-packed food to fuel hard physical work. The peanut butter added protein and fat, making the cake more filling than a regular cake. It was practical and delicious, a dessert that also functioned as sustenance. Grandma sliced it thick and wrapped it in waxed paper for the men to take to the fields. By the 1980s, peanut butter cookies became more popular than peanut butter cake, and the simple, all-by-heart cake version disappeared from home kitchens. Store-bought peanut butter desserts and boxed cake mixes replaced the homemade version. Younger generations never learned that peanut butter could replace butter and eggs, or that one jar of peanut butter could make a whole cake rich and moist without using any dairy at all. The Depression-era ingenuity of turning a jar of peanut butter into a filling, nourishing dessert was forgotten. It was ingenious, but soda cracker cake was a lovable dessert on every bare cupboard table. Grandma made it when flour was scarce or too expensive. She crushed a whole sleeve of soda crackers, saltines, into fine crumbs with a rolling pin. The crumbs replaced most of the flour in the cake. She mixed the cracker crumbs with a little flour, sugar, baking powder, and a pinch of salt. She added an egg if she had one, a little melted shortening or butter, and milk or water, and stirred it all together by feel. The batter was grainy and thick, and she poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was golden and set. The cake was light and crumbly, with a texture almost like shortbread or a tea cake. It had a subtle, salty, sweet flavor from the crackers, and it tasted plain but satisfying. Families ate it plain or with a dusting of powdered sugar. Some grandmas added a handful of raisins or a sprinkle of cinnamon for extra flavor. Others topped it with a simple glaze made from powdered sugar and water. The crackers made the cake delicate and tender, and it crumbled easily when sliced. It was perfect for dunking in coffee or tea. Grandma often made it when the flour bin was nearly empty and payday was still days away. She used what she had, a box of crackers from the pantry, and turned it into dessert. The cake was a reminder that you didn't need fancy ingredients or a full pantry to make something sweet and comforting. It was frugal baking at its finest, using what would have been eaten plain and turning it into something special. The children loved it because it tasted familiar, like the crackers they ate with soup. The salty crackers balanced the sugar in the cake, creating a flavor that was more interesting than plain vanilla. The texture was delicate and crumbly, almost dissolving on the tongue. By the 1980s, flour became cheap and plentiful, and the idea of using crackers in a cake seemed strange and old-fashioned. Boxed cake mixes replaced the by heart version, and soda cracker cake disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that crushed crackers could replace flour, or that a sleeve of saltines could become the base of a tender, crumbly cake. The ingenuity of Depression-era baking, using whatever was on hand, stretching ingredients, wasting nothing, was forgotten. The simple cracker cake vanished along with the hard times that inspired it, and with it went the knowledge that even the plainest pantry staples could be transformed into something sweet and satisfying. It was delicate, but cornstarch cake was a lovable dessert on every thrifty table. Grandma used cornstarch to stretch the flour and make the cake lighter and more tender. She mixed flour with cornstarch, usually half flour and half cornstarch, along with sugar, baking powder, and a pinch of salt. The cornstarch made the cake soft and fine-textured, almost like a sponge cake. She added an egg if she had one, a little melted butter or shortening, milk or water, and a splash of vanilla, and stirred it all together by feel. The batter was smooth and thin, and she poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was pale golden and set. The cake was light and airy, with a delicate crumb that melted in your mouth. It tasted plain and simple, with a subtle sweetness and a hint of vanilla. Families ate it plain or with a dusting of powdered sugar. Some grandmas split it into layers and filled it with homemade jam or whipped cream. Others topped it with fresh berries or a simple glaze. The cornstarch made the cake so tender it almost dissolved on the tongue, and it was perfect for serving at tea parties or church socials. It looked elegant and fancy, even though it was made from the cheapest ingredients. Grandma often made it when she wanted to impress guests, but couldn't afford expensive ingredients. The cake was white and delicate, and when sliced, it looked like a bakery cake. The cornstarch trick was an old baker's secret. It made the cake lighter and softer without adding any extra fat or eggs. It was the kind of cake that seemed too good to be true, too fancy to be cheap, but it was both. The texture was so fine and tender that guests assumed it was made with butter and cream, but it was just cornstarch and a little shortening. Grandma knew the secret, and she used it to make special occasion cakes that cost almost nothing. The cake was perfect for serving with tea or coffee, and it paired beautifully with fresh fruit or whipped cream. By the 1980s, boxed cake mixes with special light and fluffy formulas replaced the by heart version. Store-bought angel food cake and sponge cake became the standard for light, airy desserts. The simple cornstarch cake disappeared from home kitchens, and younger generations never learned that cornstarch could stretch flour and make a cake tender. The trick was forgotten, and the delicate Depression-era cake that tasted like luxury but cost pennies vanished along with the ingenuity that created it. The knowledge that cornstarch could transform a simple cake into something elegant and special was lost. It was wholesome, but brown sugar cake was a lovable dessert on every Depression table. Grandma made it when white sugar was too expensive or rationed, and she used brown sugar instead, either light or dark, which was cheaper and more flavorful. She mixed flour, brown sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. The brown sugar gave the cake a deep caramel-like flavor and made it moist and dense. She added a little melted butter or shortening, an egg if she had one, sour milk or water, and a splash of vanilla, and stirred it all together by feel. The batter was thick and sticky, and she poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was dark golden and fragrant. The cake was rich and moist, with a flavor that tasted like butterscotch or caramel. Families ate it plain or with a simple glaze made from brown sugar, butter, and cream. Some grandmas added chopped walnuts or pecans for texture. Others topped it with whipped cream or a scoop of vanilla ice cream. The brown sugar made the cake so moist it stayed fresh for a week, and the flavor got better as it sat. It was dark and rich, almost like a spice cake, and it tasted homey and comforting. Grandma often made it in the fall when the weather turned cold, and families wanted something warm and sweet. She sliced it thick and served it with coffee or tea. The cake was dense enough to fill you up, and one slice was often enough for dessert. Brown sugar was cheaper than white sugar, and it added flavor without needing extra ingredients like vanilla or spices. It was a practical choice that also made the cake taste better. The dark, caramelized flavor of brown sugar was richer and more complex than plain white sugar, and it made the cake feel special even though it was made from the cheapest ingredients. The molasses in the brown sugar added moisture and depth, creating a cake that tasted like it had been baked with care and attention, even when it was mixed by feel in 5 minutes. By the 1980s, white sugar became just as cheap as brown sugar, and brown sugar cake fell out of favor. Boxed cake mixes with artificial caramel flavoring replaced the by heart version. The simple, homemade cake disappeared from home kitchens, and younger generations never learned that brown sugar could make a cake taste rich and caramel-like without any fancy ingredients or expensive extracts. The Depression-era knowledge that brown sugar was both cheaper and more flavorful than white sugar was forgotten, and the cake that celebrated the deep, complex sweetness of molasses vanished. It was seasonal, but rhubarb cake was a lovable dessert on every springtime table. Grandma made it when rhubarb grew thick and tall in the garden before the berries ripened. She chopped fresh rhubarb stalks into small pieces, about 2 cups, and mixed them with sugar to draw out the juice. She let it sit while she made the batter. She mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. She added a little melted butter or shortening, an egg if she had one, sour milk or water, and a splash of vanilla, and stirred it all together by feel. Batter was thick and smooth, and she folded in the sugared rhubarb pieces along with any juice that had collected in the bowl, poured it into a greased pan, and baked it until it was golden and the rhubarb was tender. Cake was moist and tangy, with pockets of soft, sweet-tart rhubarb throughout. Families ate it warm with a dusting of powdered sugar or a dollop of whipped cream. Some grandmas added a handful of chopped strawberries when they were in season. Others topped it with a simple glaze or a sprinkle of cinnamon sugar before baking. Rhubarb made the cake so moist it was almost like a pudding cake, and the tartness balanced the sweetness perfectly. It was a springtime treat, made when rhubarb was free from the garden and nothing else was ripe yet. Grandma often made it for church potlucks or family gatherings in May and June. The cake was a way to use up the abundant rhubarb before it got too tough and woody. The rhubarb added moisture and flavor without needing extra butter or eggs, and it turned a simple cake into something special. The tangy, tart flavor was refreshing and bright, and it tasted like spring. The pink and green streaks of rhubarb made the cake look pretty and homemade. Grandma sliced it into squares and served it on her best plates. The children loved it because it was sweet and tangy at the same time, and the soft rhubarb pieces were fun to eat. By the 1980s, rhubarb became less common in home gardens, and younger generations didn't know how to use it. Strawberry rhubarb pie remained popular, but rhubarb cake disappeared from home kitchens. Store-bought cakes and desserts replaced the seasonal by-heart version. Younger cooks never learned that rhubarb could make a cake moist and tangy, or that 2 cups of chopped rhubarb could turn a plain cake into a springtime celebration that tasted like the garden in bloom. The tradition of making rhubarb cake every spring was forgotten. These 5 cakes, peanut butter cake, soda cracker cake, cornstarch cake, brown sugar cake, and rhubarb cake, were made from jar bottoms, cracker crumbs, and garden stalks. Grandma mixed them by feel, using whatever was cheap or free. They filled tables during hard times, All have vanished from modern kitchens. It was surprising, but beet cake was a lovable dessert on every wartime table. Grandma boiled fresh beets until they were tender, then peeled and mashed them smooth. The mashed beets replaced butter and eggs in the cake, and they added natural sweetness and a deep red color. She mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, cinnamon, cloves, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. She added the mashed beets, a little vegetable oil, and stirred it all together by feel. No eggs, no butter, just beets and pantry staples. The batter was thick and dark red, almost purple, and she poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was set and fragrant. The cake was moist and dense, with a subtle earthy sweetness from the beets and warm spices that made it taste cozy. Families ate it plain or with a simple glaze. Some grandmas added grated carrots or chopped walnuts for extra texture. Others topped it with cream cheese frosting, which became the standard years later. The beet flavor was so mild you couldn't taste it. It just made the cake moist and naturally sweet. The red color made it look festive and special, like a cake for Valentine's Day or Christmas. Grandma often made it when beets were plentiful in the garden or cheap at the market. She grated raw beets or mashed cooked ones, depending on what was easier. The cake stayed moist for days because of the beets, and it tasted better as it aged. And the children had no idea there were vegetables in the cake. They just thought it was red and delicious. The beets added moisture without making the cake heavy or dense, and the natural sugars in the beets meant Grandma could use less white sugar. It was a healthier cake. Even though no one cared about that in the 1930s, they just cared that it tasted good and cost almost nothing. The red color was vibrant and beautiful, and it made the cake look like something from a bakery, even though it was made from garden vegetables. By the 1980s, carrot cake became the standard vegetable cake, and beet cake fell out of favor. The idea of beets in dessert seemed strange, even though they were sweeter than carrots. Store-bought red velvet cake with artificial food coloring replaced the natural red color of beet cake. The simple, by heart version disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never learned that beets could make a cake moist and naturally sweet, or that two boiled beets could replace butter, eggs, and food coloring in a dessert that looked and tasted like something from a bakery. The Depression-era tradition of beet cake vanished completely. It was ancient, but honey cake was a lovable dessert on every farmhouse table. Grandma used honey instead of white sugar when sugar was rationed or too expensive. Honey was cheaper, especially if she kept bees or knew someone who did. She mixed flour, baking soda, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. She heated honey with a little water until it was warm and thin, then stirred it into the dry ingredients. No eggs, no butter, no sugar, just honey and spices mixed by feel. The batter was thick and sticky, and she poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was dark, golden, and fragrant. The cake was dense and moist, with a deep, floral sweetness from the honey and warm spices that made it taste like fall. Families ate it plain or with a dusting of powdered sugar. Some grandmas added chopped walnuts or a handful of raisins for texture. Others drizzled extra honey on top while it was still warm. The honey made the cake so moist it stayed fresh for weeks, and the flavor got richer as it aged. It was traditional for Jewish holidays, especially Rosh Hashanah, when honey symbolized a sweet new year. But it was also made by farmhouse cooks who kept bees and had honey to spare. The cake was dark and rich, almost like gingerbread, and it tasted homey and comforting. Grandma often made it in the fall when the bees had finished making honey and the jars were full. She sliced it thin and served it with tea or coffee. The honey was thick and golden, and it made the house smell sweet when the cake baked. The cake was sturdy enough to pack in lunch pails and mail to soldiers overseas during the war. The honey acted as a natural preservative, keeping the cake fresh for weeks without refrigeration. It was the perfect cake to send in care packages because it didn't spoil or dry out. The spices, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, were strong and warming, and they paired beautifully with the floral sweetness of the honey. By the 1980s, white sugar became so cheap that honey seemed expensive in comparison. Honey cake became a specialty dessert made only for holidays or by people who kept bees. The simple, by-heart version disappeared from everyday home kitchens. Store-bought cakes and desserts replaced the homemade honey cake. Younger generations never learned that honey could replace sugar, or that one jar of honey could sweeten a dozen cakes without needing a single spoonful of white sugar. The ancient tradition of honey cake, dating back thousands of years, faded into memory along with the Depression-era ingenuity that kept it alive. The knowledge that honey was both a sweetener and a preservative was forgotten. It was tropical, but coconut cake was a lovable dessert on every special occasion table. Grandma used grated coconut, either fresh from a whole coconut or dried from a bag, to make the cake rich and flavorful without using much butter or eggs. She mixed flour, sugar, baking powder, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. She added grated coconut, a little melted shortening or coconut oil, an egg if she had one, and coconut water or milk, and stirred it all together by feel. The batter was thick and chunky with coconut flakes, and she poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was golden and fragrant. The cake was moist and dense, with a sweet, nutty flavor from the coconut. Families ate it plain or with a simple glaze made from powdered sugar and coconut water. Some grandmas toasted extra coconut and sprinkled it on top for crunch. Others spread it with a thin layer of whipped cream or cream cheese frosting. The coconut made the cake so rich and filling that one small slice was enough. It tasted exotic and special, like a taste of the tropics, even though it was made from the cheapest ingredients. Grandma often made it for birthdays or holidays when she wanted something fancy. She saved up to buy a whole coconut, cracked it open with a hammer, and grated the white meat by hand on a box grater. It was hard work, but the fresh coconut tasted so much better than the dried kind. The coconut water inside the shell was sweet and clear, and she used it in the cake batter or drank it as a treat. The cake stayed moist for days because of the oil in the coconut. The coconut oil kept the cake tender and prevented it from drying out, even in hot weather. The texture was dense and chewy, almost like a macaroon, and the coconut flavor was rich and satisfying. Grandma often made it when fresh coconuts were on sale at the market, usually around the holidays. She wrapped it in waxed paper and stored it in a tin, and it stayed fresh for a week. By the 1980s, coconut cake became a fancy bakery item with thick layers of frosting and mountains of shredded coconut on the outside. The simple, one-layer, by-heart version disappeared from home kitchens. Pre-shredded coconut in bags became the standard, and no one cracked open fresh coconuts anymore. Younger generations never learned how to open a coconut, or that fresh coconut could make a cake rich and moist without using much butter or eggs. The Depression-era coconut cake, simple, humble, and made by hand, vanished along with the tradition of cracking coconuts and grating them by hand. The skill was lost. It was rich, but sour cream cake was a lovable dessert on every Sunday table. Grandma used sour cream instead of butter to make the cake moist and tender. Sour cream was cheaper than butter, and especially if she made it herself by letting fresh cream sit out and sour naturally. She mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, and a pinch of salt in a bowl. She added sour cream, an egg if she had one, and a splash of vanilla, and stirred it all together by feel. No butter, just sour cream and pantry staples. The batter was thick and smooth, and she poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was golden and fragrant. The cake was tender and moist, with a subtle tang from the sour cream that made it taste rich and buttery, even though there was no butter. Families ate it plain or with a dusting of powdered sugar. Some grandmas added a handful of raisins or a sprinkle of cinnamon for extra flavor. Others topped it with a simple glaze or fresh berries. The acidity in the sour cream reacted with the baking soda, making the cake rise light and fluffy without needing baking powder. It was chemistry and thrift working together to create something delicious. Grandma sliced it thick and served it with coffee or tea, and guests always asked for the recipe. She never wrote it down. She just mixed it by feel, the way her mother and grandmother had taught her. By the 1980s, butter became cheap and plentiful, and sour cream cake fell out of favor. Coffee cake and pound cake made with butter became the standard for rich, tender cakes. The simple sour cream cake disappeared from home kitchens. Store-bought sour cream in plastic containers replaced homemade sour cream, and younger generations never learned how to sour cream naturally, or that sour cream could make a cake tender and moist without using any butter at all. The Depression-era tradition of using sour cream in baking, turning something that would spoil into something rich and delicious, was forgotten along with the cake itself. The knowledge was lost. It was peculiar, but sad cake was a lovable dessert on every old-fashioned table. The name came from how the cake behaved. It rose in the oven, then sank as it cooled, leaving a dense, gooey center. Grandma made it with just 5 simple ingredients: flour, sugar, butter, eggs, and milk. She mixed softened butter with sugar until it was creamy, then stirred in eggs, one at a time. She added flour and a splash of milk, mixing it all together by feel. The batter was thin and smooth, almost like pancake batter, and she poured it into a greased pan and baked it until it was golden on top. As it cooled, the center sank and turned gooey and chewy, almost like a butter pecan gooey butter cake. The texture was dense and slightly sticky, with crispy edges and a soft custardy center. Families ate it warm or cold, cut into squares. Some grandmas added a handful of raisins or a sprinkle of nutmeg. Others dusted it with powdered sugar or drizzled it with honey. The cake was simple and plain, but the texture made it special. It wasn't supposed to be fluffy or light. It was supposed to be dense and gooey. The name sad came from an old baking term meaning heavy or dense, not because the cake was depressing. It was the opposite. It was comforting and filling, the kind of cake that stuck to your ribs and satisfied you with just one small piece. Grandma often made it when she didn't have time for a fancy cake or when she wanted something simple and homey. She mixed it in one bowl, poured it in the pan, and baked it. No frosting, no decoration, just a simple, honest cake. The recipe dated back to Victorian times, and it survived the Depression because it used basic ingredients that everyone had. The butter made it rich, the eggs made it custardy, and the sinking center made it gooey and addictive. It was the kind of cake you couldn't stop eating, even though it looked plain and unimpressive. By the 1980s, gooey butter cake and other dense, rich cakes became trendy, but they were made with cream cheese and fancy ingredients. The simple, old-fashioned sad cake disappeared from home kitchens. Younger generations never heard the name or tasted the dense, gooey texture. The Victorian-era tradition of sad cake, a cake that sank on purpose and was loved for its imperfection, was forgotten along with the Depression-era bakers who kept it alive. The idea that a cake could be sad and still delicious was lost. The knowledge that imperfection could be beautiful and tasty was forgotten, and the cake that celebrated simplicity and honest ingredients vanished from memory completely. These 30 Depression-era cakes fed families when money was tight and pantries were bare. Grandma mixed them by feel. No recipe cards, no measuring cups, just flour, sugar, and whatever she had on hand. She used sour milk, mashed potatoes, grated carrots, boiled beets, crushed crackers, and even tomato soup to make cakes that cost pennies, the simplest ingredients can create the sweetest memories.